The morning sun painted the Colorado territory in shades of gold and amber. When Thomas Whitmore first noticed his housekeeper's uneven gait, from his position on the front porch of the Double W Ranch, he watched Elena Vasquez sweep the steps, with careful, measured movements that spoke of hidden pain. For 3 months, she had worked in his home with quiet efficiency, speaking only when spoken to, her dark eyes holding secrets he dared not ask about. She was a mystery wrapped in calico and determination. Thomas had learned to respect the invisible walls she'd built around herself. But today, something was different. Today, he saw her wince as she bent to gather the dust into her pan. Saw how she favored her left leg as she climbed the steps to the main house. A terrible suspicion began to form in his mind, one that made his jaw clench and his hands curl. Into fists, Thomas Whitmore was not a man given to impulse or emotion. At 35, he had earned his reputation as the quietest rancher in Clearwater County. He spoke little, observed much, and kept his own counsel. His neighbors respected him for his fair dealings and his unwavering word. A few claimed to truly know him. The truth was, Thomas had built his silence like armor around a heart that had been broken too many times. First by the war that took his brothers, then by the woman who'd promised to wait for him, but married another while he was fighting at Gettysburg. Now, at an age when most men had families of their own, he lived alone in a house too big for one person, content to lose himself in the endless work of running cattle across 10,000 acres of Colorado grassland, or so he'd told himself, until Elena arrived. She'd come to his door on a Tuesday morning in late spring, her few possessions tied in a worn shawl, her English careful but accented with the musical lilt of her native Mexico. She'd heard in town that he needed help with his house, she'd said. She was clean, hardworking, and asked for little more than room and board and a small wage. Thomas had hired her on the spot, not because he particularly needed the help, but because something in her eyes, a combination of pride and desperation, reminded him of his own reflection in darker moments. Now, watching her struggle with pain she thought no one could see, Thomas felt something stir in his chest that he'd believed long dead. It was more than concern for an employee. It was the protective instinct of a man who recognized a kindred spirit in hiding. He waited until she'd finished her morning chores and retreated to the small room he'd given her off the kitchen. Then he knocked, soft but insistent. "Elena, right. I have a word." The silence stretched so long he wondered if she'd heard him. Finally her voice came through the door, tight with control. "I am resting, Senator Whitmore. Perhaps later. It's about your leg." Another silence, longer this time. When she opened the door, her face was carefully composed, but Thomas could see the wariness in her dark eyes. "My leg is fine, Sana. It does not affect my work." Thomas studied her face, noting the pale cast to her olive skin, the way she held herself rigid to avoid showing pain. "Elena, I've been watching you all morning. You're hurt, and it's getting worse." "I am fine," she repeated, but her voice cracked slightly on the words. Thomas had faced down rustlers and survived cavalry charges, but the look of trapped desperation in Elena's eyes made him choose his next words more carefully than any he'd ever spoken. "I'm not asking as your employer," he said quietly. "I'm asking as someone who cares about your welfare. Will you let me help?" Something flickered across her face, surprise, perhaps, or hope quickly suppressed. For a moment, he thought she might confide in him. Then her wall slammed back into place. "There is nothing you can do, Senator Whitmore. Some things cannot be helped." But Thomas was nothing if not persistent. Over the next several days, he found excuses to stay close to the house, watching Elena's movements with growing concern. Her limp was worse in the mornings and evenings, better in the heat of midday. She thought she hid her pain well. But Thomas had learned to read the subtle signs, the way she gripped the porch rail when she thought no one was looking, the careful way she lowered herself into chairs. On Thursday morning, his patience ran out. Elena was hanging laundry on the line behind the house when her leg finally gave out. Thomas heard her sharp cry of pain from the barn and reached her just as she was struggling to pull herself upright, her face white with agony and embarrassment. "Enough," he said firmly, scooping her into his arms before she could protest. "Going to see Doc Hartwell?" "No." The word came out sharp and panicked. "Please, Senar, put me down. I cannot see the doctor. Thomas paused, Elena's small form cradled against his chest, her hands clutching at his shirt. Why not? For a moment, he thought she might tell him. Her dark eyes searched his face, as if looking for something she desperately needed to find. Then she seemed to crumble inward. Because then they will know, she whispered. And if they know, he will find me. The words hit Thomas like a physical blow. In that instant, he understood everything, the careful way she moved. The fear that flickered in her eyes whenever strangers came to the ranch, the reason she'd arrived with nothing but the clothes on her back. Who? Alina. He asked gently, though part of him already knew. Who are you running from? She closed her eyes, tears slipping down her cheeks. My husband. Thomas felt something cold and hard settle in his stomach. He'd suspected, but hearing it confirmed made him want to find the man responsible and show him what real pain felt like.
Ow.
Instead, he tightened his arms around Alina protectively. He hurt you. It wasn't a question. Alina nodded, fresh tears flowing. Diego. He has a terrible temper. At first, it was only words. But then, she gestured helplessly at her leg. I fell down the stairs, he told everyone. But I did not fall. Thomas carried her to the parlor and settled her carefully on the sofa, then knelt beside her, his large hands gentle as they framed her face. Alina, look at me. When she did, he was struck by how young she looked despite the pain etched around her eyes. She couldn't be more than 25, yet she carried herself with the weariness of someone much older. You're safe here, do you understand? Can't hurt you anymore. You do not know Diego, she whispered. He has friends, connections. If he finds me, then we'll deal with that when it happens, Thomas said firmly. Right now, you need medical attention. Doc Hartwell is a good man, and he's also discreet. He won't ask questions you don't want to answer. Lena searched his face again, and whatever she saw there seemed to give her courage. She nodded slowly. Doc Hartwell's office was located above the general store in Clearwater's Main Street. Elderly physician had tended everything from gunshot wounds to difficult births during his 30 years on the frontier, and nothing much surprised him anymore. But even he couldn't hide his reaction when Thomas carried Alina up the narrow stairs. Good Lord, he muttered, taking in her pallor and the careful way Thomas held her. What happened? Old injury, Thomas said simply, acting up. Doc Hartwell's keen eyes moved between them. Noting the protective way Thomas held Alina and the trust implicit in her relaxed posture against his chest. The doctor had known Thomas since he'd first arrived in Colorado, and he'd never seen the quiet rancher show such concern for another person. Well, let's have a look then. The examination was gentle but thorough, and Doc Hartwell's face grew, increasingly grim as he worked. When he was finished, he washed his hands carefully before turning to face them both. The leg was broken, he said without preamble. It's badly broken and it wasn't set properly. That's why you're in pain, Mrs. Vasquez. Alina supplied quietly. Mrs. Vasquez. The bone has healed, but not correctly. Without proper treatment, you'll likely develop a permanent limp, and the pain will only get worse over time. Lena's face fell. There is nothing to be done. I didn't say that. Hartwell pulled up a chair, his expression serious. The bone would need to be rebroken and set properly. It's a difficult procedure, and the recovery would be long and painful. But it could be done. How long? Thomas asked. 6 weeks of complete bed rest, minimum. Probably longer before she could return to normal activities. Alina was already shaking her head. I cannot afford ... I have no money for such a procedure. Figure that out, Thomas said firmly, ignoring her startled look. The important thing is getting you well. Doc Hartwell watched this exchange with interest. There's something else you should know, he said carefully. This injury, it's consistent. With a deliberate break, someone grabbed this leg and twisted it with considerable force. The temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. Thomas's face went very still, and when he spoke, his voice was deadly quiet. I see. Alina reached for his hand, her small fingers wrapping around his much larger ones. Thomas, please. Do not do anything foolish. Diego is dangerous. It was the first time she'd used his given name, and the sound of it on her lips sent warmth through his chest, even as rage burned. In his gut, he squeezed her hand gently. Where is he now? I do not know. When I left, he was in Santa Fe, but he has been searching for me. I have heard rumors. Doc Hartwell cleared his throat. Perhaps we should focus on the immediate medical situation. Mrs. Vasquez, if you decide to have the surgery, you'll need someone to care for you during your recovery. It's not something you could manage alone. I will care for her, Thomas said without hesitation. Both Alina and Doc Hartwell stared at him. Elena's eyes were wide with surprise and something that might have been hope. Thomas, you cannot. It would not be proper for you to... You're my employee, Thomas said firmly. Your injury happened while you were in my employ. It's my responsibility to see that you receive proper care. It was a lie, and they all knew it. Elena's injury was months old, sustained long before she'd come to work for him. But Doc Hartwell simply nodded and began preparing his instruments. We should do this as soon as possible, he said. The longer we wait, the more difficult the procedure becomes. Lena looked between the two men, her face pale but determined. If I have this surgery, how long before I can work again, Alina? Thomas said gently. Don't worry about work right now. But I must work, she said urgently. I cannot be a burden. I will not be dependent on anyone's charity. The pride in her voice reminded Thomas sharply of himself, and he understood suddenly that this was about more than money or propriety. Lena had fought hard for her independence, had risked everything to escape a bad situation, and she was terrified of losing control again. It wouldn't be charity, he said carefully. You've been working for room and board. During your recovery, you'll be resting for room and board. The work will be there when you're well. Lena studied his face, searching for pity or condescension, and finding neither. Finally, she nodded. When she asked Doc Hartwell, it's tomorrow morning if you're willing. I'll need to send for some supplies, but I can have everything ready by then. They made the arrangements quickly. Thomas would bring Alina to town early in the morning. She would stay at the doctor's house during the initial recovery period. Once she was stable enough to travel, he would take her back to the ranch. As they prepared to leave, Doc Hartwell pulled Thomas aside. You know what you're taking on? The older man asked quietly. A woman recovering from a procedure like this will need constant care, feeding, bathing, help with personal matters. It's not easy work, and it's not work most men would take on for an employee. Thomas met the doctor's knowing gaze steadily. Lena isn't just an employee. I figured as much. The question is, does she know that? Thomas glanced toward the outer room where Alina waited, then back at Doc Hartwell. I don't know, but I aim to find out. The surgery took place the following morning in Doc Hartwell's small operating room. Thomas paced the parlor downstairs for 3 hours, listening to the muffled sounds from above and trying not to imagine everything that could go wrong. When Doc Hartwell finally emerged, his shirt was soaked with sweat and his hands shook slightly from exhaustion. How is she? Thomas demanded. Alive. The surgery went well, but the next few days will be critical. She'll be in considerable pain, and there's always the risk of infection. The doctor sank into a chair, suddenly looking every one of his 60-odd years. I've given her laudanum for the pain, but she'll need constant watching. I'll stay in town, Thomas said immediately. That's not necessary. She'll be unconscious for hours yet, and I can manage tonight. But tomorrow, ... double quotes, Doc Hartwell gave him a meaningful look. Tomorrow, you might want to think about taking her home. She'll be more comfortable in familiar surroundings. And frankly, I think she'll better with you than with me. Thomas spent that night at the hotel, lying awake and staring at the ceiling. Somewhere across town, Alina was fighting her way through the first night of what would be a long recovery. He found himself thinking about the trust she'd shown in agreeing to the surgery, the way she'd looked at him when he'd promised to care for her. The truth was, his feelings for Alina had been growing steadily since she'd arrived at the ranch. At first, he'd told himself it was simple attraction. She was a beautiful woman, and he was a lonely man. But it had become something deeper than that. He admired her quiet strength, her dignity in the face of hardship, the way she'd rebuilt. Her life from nothing, now knowing what she'd suffered. His admiration had transformed into something fiercer and more protective. The thought of anyone hurting her made him want to commit violence. The thought of her leaving made his chest tight with panic. But Elena was vulnerable right now. It's dependent on his care and goodwill. Whatever his feelings, he had to be careful not to take advantage of that vulnerability. She needed to heal, physically and emotionally, before she could make clear decisions about her future. The next morning, he arrived at Doc Hartwell's house to find Elena awake but groggy from the laudanum. Her face was pale and drawn with pain, but her eyes were alert. "Thomas," she whispered when she saw him. "I'm here." He moved to her bedside, taking her hand carefully. "How do you feel?" "Like a horse kicked me," she admitted, with a weak smile. "But Doc Hartwell says the surgery went well." "It did indeed," the doctor confirmed, entering the room with a breakfast tray. "The bone is properly aligned now. But with time and rest, you should regain full use of the leg." Elena's eyes filled with tears of relief. "Thank you, doctor. I do not know how I will ever repay you." "Just focus on getting well," Doc Hartwell said kindly. Then he turned to Thomas. "I think she's stable enough to travel, if you're still planning to take her to the ranch." "Only if you feel up to it," Thomas said to Elena. "There's no rush." Elena looked around the small room, then back at his face. "I would like to go home," she said softly, and Thomas's heart lurched at her use of the word. The journey back too. The ranch was slow and careful, with Elena lying in the back of Thomas's wagon on a bed of soft blankets. Every bump in the road made her wince. Despite the laudanum Doc Hartwell had given her for the pain, Thomas had arranged the downstairs parlor as a temporary bedroom, moving in a comfortable bed and positioning it near the window so Elena could look out at the mountains she loved. He'd also hired Mrs. Henderson, the minister's wife, to help with Elena's more personal care, though he planned to handle most of her needs himself. The first week was the hardest. Elena drifted in and out of consciousness, her body fighting to heal from the trauma of surgery. When she was awake, she was often in too much pain to do more than sip broth or water. Thomas barely left her side, dozing in a chair beside her bed and waking at her slightest movement. On the fourth night, Elena developed a fever. Thomas sent for Doc Hartwell immediately, but the doctor was attending a difficult birth across the county and couldn't come until morning. That left Thomas alone with Elena as her temperature climbed and she began to ramble in Spanish, reliving memories he couldn't understand but could tell were painful. He spent the night bathing her face with cool cloths and holding her hand when nightmares made her cry out. Sometimes she seemed to think he was someone else, her brother, perhaps, or a friend from childhood. But occasionally she would look directly at him with perfect clarity. "You are a good man, Thomas Whitmore," she whispered during one of these lucid moments. "Why do you care for me so?" Thomas smoothed her dark hair back from her fevered brow. "Because you matter to me, Elena, more than I probably should tell you right now." She studied his face in the lamplight. "I am not free to matter to anyone. I am still married." "That's not a real marriage," Thomas said quietly. "A man who breaks his wife's leg doesn't deserve the title of husband. The law would not agree. Then the law is wrong." Elena closed her eyes, but she didn't pull her hand away from his. "If things were different, ... They will be different," Thomas said firmly. "You're going to get well, and then we'll figure out the rest." By morning, Elena's fever had broken, and Doc Hartwell pronounced her out of immediate danger. The crisis had passed, but it had changed something between them. The careful boundaries they'd maintained had blurred during those long hours of the night, and they both felt it, as Elena grew stronger. Their daily routines developed a domestic intimacy that both treasured and tried not to examine too closely. Thomas would help her with breakfast, propping pillows behind her back and cutting her food into manageable pieces. They would read together in the afternoons Elena had discovered Thomas's small library and was working her way through his collection of poetry. In the evenings, they would sit by the fire, talking quietly about their lives, their dreams, their fears. It was during one of these evening conversations that Elena finally told him the full story of her marriage. "I was 17 when I married Diego," she said, her fingers tracing patterns on the quilt covering her legs. "My father had died, and my mother thought it was a good match. Diego was older, established, with a successful business in Santa Fe. He seemed ... sophisticated, worldly. Thomas listened without interruption, sensing that she needed to tell this story in her own way. At first he was charming, attentive. He bought me beautiful clothes, jewelry, took me to parties with important people. I thought I was so lucky. Elena's voice grew bitter. I was so naive. What changed? Thomas asked gently. I did. Or rather, I began to express opinions of my own. Diego liked the idea of a beautiful young wife, but he expected complete obedience. When I disagreed with him about small things, what to wear, where to go, he would become angry, not violent at first. Just ... cold. Cutting. Thomas felt his jaw clench, but kept his expression neutral. The first time he hit me was 6 months after our wedding. I had spoken to another man at a party, an old friend of my father's, who was asking about my family. Diego accused me of flirting, of making him look foolish in front of his associates. Elena touched her cheek unconsciously. He apologized afterward, brought me flowers, said it would never happen again. But it did, yes. Each time, there was a reason. I had burned dinner, or spent too much money, or looked at him the wrong way. And each time, he was sorry afterward, till he wasn't sorry anymore. Thomas had heard enough stories from his fellow soldiers to know how these things progressed, but hearing it from Elena made his blood boil. What about your family? Friends? Diego isolated me carefully. He convinced me that my family disapproved of our marriage, that they thought I had gotten above myself. He chose which friends I could see, monitored my correspondence. By the time I realized what was happening, I had nowhere to turn. The night you left, Elena was quiet for a long moment. He had been drinking. More than usual. I said something I do not even remember what, and he flew into a rage. He grabbed my leg and twisted until I heard it snap. Her voice was barely above a whisper now. I thought he might kill me that night. When he finally passed out, I took what little money I could find and left. I have been running ever since. Thomas reached for her hand, holding it gently. You're not running anymore. Lena looked at him with eyes that held too much pain for someone so young. He will not stop looking for me, Thomas. Diego is not a man who accepts defiance. If he finds me here, he won't, Thomas said with quiet conviction. And if he does, he'll have to go through me first. The words hung in the air between them, loaded with implications neither was quite ready to address. Elena squeezed his hand. You have already done so much for me. I cannot ask you to risk your life as well. You're not asking. I'm offering. Why? The question came out raw, vulnerable. Why would you do this for me? Thomas looked into her dark eyes and decided the time for careful boundaries had passed. Because I love you, Elena. Because somewhere along the way, you became the most important thing in my world. Because the thought of anyone hurting you makes me want to commit murder. And the thought of you leaving makes me want to beg you to stay. Elena's breath caught. Thomas, ... I know it's complicated, he said quickly. I know you're still legally married, and I know you need time to heal. I'm not asking for anything from you right now. I just needed you to know. Tears slipped down Elena's cheeks. I love you too, she whispered. I have for weeks, but I am so afraid. ... Of what? Of bringing danger to you. Of not being free to love you properly. Being broken in ways that cannot be healed. Thomas shifted carefully onto the edge of the bed, cradling her face in his hands. Elena, look at me. You are not broken. You are the strongest, bravest person. I know. You survived something terrible and built a new life from nothing. That's not broken. That's extraordinary. Elena leaned into his touch, closing her eyes. What if he finds us? And we'll face that together. But Elena, you can't live your life in fear of what might happen. You've already given him too much. Of your life, don't give him your future too. Elena opened her eyes and looked at him with an expression that was part hope, part terror, and entirely love. What are you asking me? I'm asking you to stay, to build a life here with me. When you're ready, when you feel safe, I want to marry you properly. I want to give you the life you deserve. But I am already married, not in any way that matters. When you're well enough to travel, we'll go to Denver. Find a lawyer who can help us dissolve that marriage legally. There has to be a way. Alina searched his face, looking for doubt or uncertainty and finding none. Finally, she nodded. "Yes," she whispered. "Yes, I will stay." Thomas kissed her then, soft and gentle, tasting salt from her tears. It was a kiss full of promise and patience, love tempered with understanding. When they broke apart, Alina rested, her forehead against his. "I never thought I could feel safe again," she murmured. "But with you I do." "You are safe," Thomas promised. "Always." For 6 weeks they lived in their small bubble of happiness. Alina grew stronger each day, progressing. From bedridden to walking with crutches to finally taking tentative steps on her own. The bone had healed perfectly, and though she would always have a slight limp, the constant pain was gone. More importantly, the fear that had shadowed her eyes began to fade. She laughed more often, sang while she worked, began making plans for their future together. They talked about expanding the ranch, maybe starting a family. Alina wanted to plant a garden, to put down roots in the truest sense. Thomas had never been happier. Coming home each evening to find Alina waiting for him, sharing meals and conversations and quiet moments by the fire. It was everything he'd dreamed of but never thought he'd have. They were careful to maintain propriety. Mrs. Henderson still came by daily, and Alina slept in her own room. But the emotional intimacy between them grew deeper each day. It was during the 7th week of Alina's recovery that their peaceful world came crashing down. Thomas was in the north pasture, checking on a mare about to foal, when he heard the sound of approaching horses. Something about the rhythm made him uneasy, not the casual pace of neighbors or the urgent gallop of someone with news, but the purposeful approach of men with serious business. He mounted his horse and rode toward the house, his unease growing when he saw 3 riders approaching the front yard. Even from a distance, he could see they weren't locals. Their clothes were too fine, their posture too rigid, and the man in the center. Thomas's blood ran cold as he recognized the type. He'd seen men like this during the war, men who used violence as a tool and wore their cruelty like a badge of honor. This had to be Diego Vasquez. He spurred his horse faster, but he was still a quarter-mile away when the men reached the house. From his position, he could see Alina emerge onto the front porch, then freeze as she recognized the lead rider, even across the distance. Thomas could hear Diego's voice, sharp with anger and satisfaction. Couldn't make out the words, but Alina's body language told him everything he needed to know. She was terrified. Thomas drove his horse harder, but he was running out of time. He saw Diego dismount, saw Alina back toward the door, saw one of the other men move to block her escape. Then he saw Diego raise his hand. "Alina." Thomas's shout carried across the prairie, causing all 4 people in the yard to turn toward him. He was close enough now to see Diego's face, clearly a handsome man gone to seed, with cold eyes and a cruel mouth. "Ah," Diego called out in accented English. "The rescuer arrives." How touching. "Maid." Thomas reined in his horse at the edge of the yard, his hand moving instinctively toward the gun at his hip. "You're trespassing on my property?" Diego smiled, but it was the expression of a predator. "I am simply collecting what belongs to me. My wife seems to have forgotten her vows." "I haven't forgotten anything," Alina said, her voice shaking but determined. "I remember every bruise, every broken promise, every night I lay awake wondering if you would kill me in my sleep." "Such dramatics," Diego said dismissively. "You always were prone to exaggeration." Thomas dismounted slowly, keeping his movements deliberate and non-threatening while he assessed the situation. Diego and his 2 companions all wore guns, and they had the confidence of men accustomed to violence. But Thomas had advantages too. This was his land, and he knew every rock and tree. More importantly, he was fighting for something that mattered. "More than his own life?" "Alina," he said quietly, not taking his eyes off Diego. "Go inside." "The lady stays," Diego said sharply. "We are not finished with our reunion." "Yes, you are." Thomas took a step forward. "Alina is under my protection now. You have no claim on her." Diego laughed, a sound like breaking glass. "No claim?" "She is my wife's center, in the eyes of God and the law, and I have come to take her home, over my dead body. That can be arranged." Diego's hand moved to his gun. I have heard about you, Thomas Whitmore, the quiet rancher who keeps to himself. But you are alone here, and we are three. Even a war hero cannot win those odds. Thomas felt the familiar calm that had served him well in battle settle over him. Maybe not, but I'll take you with me. For a moment the yard was silent except for the sound of wind through the grass and the distant lowing of cattle. Then Alina stepped forward. Stop, she said firmly. Both of you, stop this. She moved past Thomas, ignoring his sharp protest, and faced her husband directly. Thomas had to admire her courage even as he cursed her timing. Diego, you want me to come with you? The Mexican smiled triumphantly. Of course, mi amor, all is forgiven. We will start again. And if I refuse, Diego's expression hardened. Then, I will kill your lover and burn his ranch to the ground. And then you will come with me anyway. Lena nodded as if she'd expected this answer. I see. And if I come willingly, then perhaps Senator Whitmore lives to see another sunset. Thomas started to protest, but Alina silenced him with a look. Could see the wheels turning in her mind, could almost follow her thoughts. She was trying to protect him, willing to sacrifice herself to keep him safe. The knowledge made his chest tight with love and terror. Very well, Alina said. Well, come with you. But first, I want to gather my things. Diego looked suspicious. You need nothing from this place. I have jewelry, Alina said. My mother's jewelry. Surely you would not want to leave that behind. Greed flickered in Diego's eyes. Alina's mother had been from a wealthy family, and her jewelry was worth a considerable sum. Very well, but be quick about it. And remember, if you try anything foolish, your lover pays the price. Alina nodded and walked toward the house. As she passed Thomas, she brushed against him her hand. Slipping something small and hard into his palm, a key. Thomas closed his fingers around it, understanding immediately. Alina kept a derringer in her room. A small gun Doc Hartwell had suggested she carry for protection. She was giving him the key to the box where she stored it. But as Alina disappeared into the house, Thomas realized she had no intention of using that gun to escape. She had given him the key because she meant to go with Diego, and she wanted Thomas to have some protection after she was gone. The thought made him want to roar with frustration. Didn't she understand that her safety mattered more to him than his own life? That he would rather die fighting than live knowing she was in Diego's hands? She is quite beautiful, is she not? Diego said conversationally, as if they were discussing the weather. So passionate in bed. I trust you have enjoyed her. ... Services. Thomas felt rage explode in his chest, but he kept his expression neutral. Diego was trying to provoke him into doing something stupid. Alina is a lady. I won't listen to you speak of her otherwise. A lady, Diego laughed. It was a whore who ran away from her husband. But do not worry. We'll teach her proper behavior once we are home. Touch her again, and I'll hunt you down like a rabid dog. Brave words from a man who is about to lose everything that matters to him. Alina emerged from the house carrying a small cloth bag. She had changed into her traveling dress, and her face was composed, almost serene. She looked like a woman going to her execution with dignity intact. I'm ready, she said simply. Diego gestured toward his horse. Mount up. We have a long journey. Ahead Alina walked toward the horse, then paused beside Thomas. Thank you, she said quietly, for everything, for giving me a place to heal, for showing me what love could be. I will never forget. Alina, don't do this, Thomas said urgently. We can fight them, together. She smiled, and it nearly broke his heart. I will not let him hurt you because of me. I have caused enough pain in my life. You haven't caused any pain? You've brought nothing but joy. Thomas, I love you, he said desperately. That has to count for something. It counts for everything, Alina whispered. That is why I have to go. Diego was growing impatient. Enough, Alina. Get on the horse now. Alina looked at Thomas one last time, memorizing his face. Then she walked to Diego's horse and allowed him to help her mount. The irony wasn't lost on Thomas. The same hands that had broken her leg were now helping her into the saddle. A pleasure meeting you, Senator Whitmore, Diego said mockingly as he swung up behind Alina. Do not follow us, or Alina will pay the price for your foolishness. They rode away at a gallop, heading south toward the New Mexico border. Thomas watched until they disappeared over a ridge, his hands clenched into fists, Elena's key cutting into his palm. For several minutes after they were gone, Thomas stood frozen in his yard, paralyzed by the magnitude of what had just happened. Elena was gone. The woman he loved, the woman who had become his whole world, was in the hands of a man who had already broken her once, and would undoubtedly do worse now that she had defied him. The smart thing to do was let her go. Diego had been right about one thing: Thomas was just one man, and they had a significant head start. By the time he could gather help, they could be across the territorial border and beyond the reach of Colorado law. But Thomas had never been particularly interested in doing the smart thing when someone he loved was in danger. He ran to the house. Using Elena's key to retrieve the Derringer from her room, it was a small weapon meant for close-quarters defense, but it was better than nothing. He also grabbed his rifle, extra ammunition, and supplies for several days on the trail. As he saddled his fastest horse, Thomas's mind raced through his options. Diego had a head start, but he was also traveling with a woman who was still recovering from surgery. They would have to rest, probably make camp for the night. Thomas knew this country better than any outsider could. More importantly, he had something Diego didn't: the burning certainty that he would rather die than let Elena suffer another day of abuse. He had been riding hard for 2 hours when he encountered Sheriff Jake Morrison heading toward the ranch with 2 deputies. "Thomas!" Morrison called out, reining in his horse. "Where are you going in such a hurry?" "We got word there was trouble at your place." Thomas pulled up, his mind racing. He trusted Morrison. The sheriff was a fair man who'd served the territory well for over a decade. But explaining the situation would take time, and every minute delay put Elena further from safety. "Elena's husband found her," Thomas said tersely. "Took her against her will. I'm going after them." Morrison's expression grew grave. He'd heard rumors about Thomas's housekeeper, had suspected there was more to her story than anyone was saying. How long ago? 2 hours? Maybe 3? They're heading south? "Thomas, you can't take on 3 armed men alone. It's suicide." "Then come with me," Thomas said bluntly. "Help me get her back." Morrison exchanged glances with his deputies. "This is outside our jurisdiction if they cross into New Mexico." "I don't care about jurisdiction, I care about Elena." The sheriff studied Thomas's face, noting the desperate determination there. Morrison had known Thomas for years, had watched him rebuild his life after the war with quiet dignity. He'd never seen the man show such raw emotion about anything. "Right," Morrison said finally. "But we do this legally. If we catch them before they cross the border, we can arrest the husband for kidnapping and assault." "You mentioned Elena was injured? Broken leg?" "Deliberately. Doc Hartwell can testify to that." Morrison nodded grimly. "That's enough for charges. Let's ride." They pushed their horses hard, following the trail Diego's party had left through the grassland. Thomas rode with single-minded focus, his eyes scanning the ground for signs of their passage. As the sun began to sink toward the western mountains, he finally spotted what he'd been looking for: smoke from a campfire in a grove of cottonwoods. "About a mile ahead," there he said quietly, pointing toward the trees. Morrison studied the location through his spyglass. "I count 3 men, 1 woman. Looks like they're settling in for the night. How do we approach?" "Carefully. If they see us coming, they might use the woman as a shield." Morrison lowered the spyglass, his expression serious. "Thomas, I need your word that you'll follow my lead on this. I know what she means to you, but we have to be smart about it." Thomas wanted to charge into that camp with guns blazing, to make Diego pay for every moment of fear Elena had endured. But he also knew that getting her killed in a rescue attempt would accomplish nothing. "You have my word," he said finally. They dismounted and approached the camp on foot, moving through the gathering darkness with the stealth of experienced frontiersmen. As they drew closer, they could hear voices: Diego speaking in rapid Spanish, his tone angry and demanding. Thomas's jaw clenched as he made out enough words to understand the gist. Diego was berating Elena for her betrayal, threatening worse punishment once they reached Santa Fe. Elena's responses were too quiet to hear, but Thomas could see her sitting by the fire, her back straight despite her obvious fear. Morrison held up his hand, signaling for quiet, then gestured for his deputies to circle around to the far side of the camp. The plan was simple: surround them, call for surrender, hope they gave up without a fight. But plans rarely survived contact with the enemy. Thomas was moving into position when he stepped on a dry branch. The crack seemed to echo through the grove like a gunshot. Instantly, Diego was on his feet, his pistol drawn and pressed against Elena's temple. "Show yourselves," Diego shouted. "I know you are there." Morrison cursed under his breath, then stepped into the firelight with his hands. Raised his badge visible on his vest. "Sheriff Morrison, Clearwater County." "Lower your weapon and step away from the woman." Diego's two companions had also drawn their guns, scanning the darkness for threats. They were outnumbered, but they had the advantage of cover and a hostage. "Think not, Sheriff," Diego said with cold calm. "Elena is my wife, and I am within my rights to take her home." "Not if you're hurting her, you're not," Morrison replied. "We have evidence of assault. There's a warrant for your arrest." Diego laughed harshly. "Your jurisdiction ends at the territorial border, Sheriff. We will be across that border long before your warrant means anything." Thomas watched this exchange from his position in the shadows, his attention focused entirely on Elena. She hadn't spoken since the confrontation began, but he could see the tension in her posture. The way she held herself ready to move despite the gun at her head. Their eyes met across the flickering firelight, and Thomas saw something there that made his heart skip. Elena wasn't just sitting passively, waiting to be rescued. She was planning something. Very slightly, she shifted her weight, tilting her head away from Diego's gun. At the same time, her hand moved to her skirt, gathering the fabric almost imperceptibly. Thomas understood immediately. Elena was giving him a target if he could get a clear shot at Diego. She would throw herself clear. It was dangerous, requiring split-second timing, but it might be their only chance. Thomas drew the derringer, knowing he would only get one shot, so the small gun wasn't accurate at distance. But if he could get closer— "You know what I think, Sheriff?" Diego continued, his voice growing more confident. "I think you should take your men and ride away." "Leave us to our family business." "Can't do that," Morrison replied steadily. "The lady doesn't want to go with you. That makes it kidnapping. The lady is my wife. She goes where I tell her to go." Elena finally spoke, her voice clear and strong despite her precarious situation. "I am not your wife anymore, Diego. I stopped being your wife the night you broke my leg." Diego's face twisted with rage. "You belong to me. Until death do us part, remember?" "Then death it is," Elena said calmly. In one fluid motion, she drove her elbow back into Diego's ribs while throwing herself sideways away from his gun. Diego doubled over, gasping, and Thomas took his shot. The derringer's report was sharp and loud in the confined space of the grove. Diego spun and fell, clutching his shoulder, his own gun flying from his grasp. All hell broke loose. Diego's companions opened fire, forcing Morrison and his deputies to dive for cover. Thomas rushed toward Elena, who was struggling to her feet. Near the edge of the firelight, "Elena, this way!" She ran toward him, limping but moving fast. Thomas caught her hand and pulled her behind the thick trunk of a cottonwood just as bullets began splintering the bark around them. "Are you hurt?" he asked urgently, running his hands over her arms and shoulders, checking for wounds. "No, I am." "Fine, Thomas. You came for me." "Of course I came for you," he said fiercely, pulling her close. "Did you think I would just let him take you?" The gunfight was intensifying around them. Morrison and his deputies had better positions, but Diego's men were fighting with the desperation of cornered animals. And Diego himself, despite his wounded shoulder, had retrieved another gun and was firing wildly in their direction.
"To
get you out of here," Thomas said, reloading the derringer. "I am not leaving without you, Elena." "No," her voice was firm, final. "I have run enough. I will not run any more." Thomas looked into her eyes and saw the truth there. Elena had found her courage, her strength. She was no longer the frightened. A woman who had arrived at his ranch months ago. She was a woman who knew what she wanted and was willing to fight for it. "All right," he said. "Then we finish this together." The battle was brief but fierce. Morrison's training and experience told, and his deputies were crack shots. Within minutes, Diego's two companions were wounded and surrendering. Diego himself lasted longer, driven by rage and desperation. But eventually he too was overwhelmed. When the smoke cleared, Diego lay unconscious from blood loss, his shoulders shattered by Thomas's shot. His companions were wounded but alive, and more importantly, no one on Morrison's side had been seriously hurt. Well, Morrison said, surveying the scene, that could have gone worse. Thomas helped Alina to her feet, his arm around her waist. She was trembling now that the immediate danger was past, the adrenaline leaving her system. Is it over? She asked quietly. It's over, Thomas confirmed. Diego will go to prison. You're free. Alina closed her eyes, leaning against his strength. Free, she repeated, as if testing the word. I had almost forgotten what that felt like. Morrison approached them, his expression serious but not unsympathetic. Mrs. Vasquez, I'm going to need a statement from you. It's about the abuse, the circumstances of your leaving. It'll help ensure your husband faces appropriate charges. Alina nodded. I will tell you everything, Sheriff. No more secrets, no more hiding. Good. We'll head back to Clearwater in the morning, get this all sorted out properly. Morrison glanced between Thomas and Alina, noting how naturally they stood together, how protectively Thomas held her. In the meantime, I think you two have some talking to do. As Morrison moved away to supervise the securing of the prisoners, Thomas and Alina found themselves alone by the dying campfire. The grove was quiet now except for the normal sounds of the night wind in the leaves. The distant call of an owl, the soft murmur of the sheriff's voice as he spoke to his deputies. Thomas, Alina said softly, looking up at him in the flickering light. What you did tonight, Dot. Risking your life for me. Dot. I would do it again, Thomas said simply. I would do it 1,000 times. Why? Because I love you. Because you're worth fighting for. Because a world without you in it isn't a world. I want to live in... Alina reached up to touch his face, her fingers tracing the line of his jaw. I love you too, so much that it frightens me sometimes. You don't have to be frightened anymore. Diego can't hurt you now. It is not Diego I fear, Alina said quietly. It is myself. The part of me that learned to accept pain, to believe I deserved it. What if I am too damaged to be the wife you deserve? Thomas caught her hand, pressing it flat against his chest where she could feel his heartbeat. Alina, listen to me. You are not damaged. You are not broken. You are the strongest, most courageous woman I have ever known. The fact that you survived what you did, that you found the strength to leave, to build a new life that's not damage, that's proof of how extraordinary you are. Tears slipped down Alina's cheeks. How can you be so certain? Because I know. I've watched you heal, seen your kindness, your strength, your capacity for joy despite everything you've endured. The woman I fell in love with isn't broken. She's beautiful and whole and perfect, exactly as she is. Alina searched his face in the firelight, looking for doubt or pity and finding neither. What she saw instead was absolute, unwavering love, the kind of love she had never dared to hope for. Thomas Whitmore, she said softly, will you marry me? Thomas's heart stopped. Alina... I know it is not proper for the woman to ask, she continued, her voice growing stronger with each word. But I have spent too much of my life waiting for other people to make decisions for me. I know what I want now. I want you. I want a life with you. I want to wake up every morning knowing I am safe and loved and free to love you in return. Thomas cupped her face in his hands, his thumb brushing away her tears. Are you sure? There's no rush, no pressure. We can take all the time you need to. I have had time, Alina interrupted. Months of healing, of learning to trust again, of falling deeper in love with you every day. I do not need more time, Thomas. I need you. Then yes, Thomas said, his voice rough with emotion. Yes, I will marry you. I will love you and protect you and spend every day for the rest of my life proving that you made the right choice. He kissed her then, soft and deep and full of promise. It was a kiss that tasted of freedom and hope and the kind of love that could survive anything the world threw at it. When they broke apart, Alina rested her forehead against his. "When?" she asked. Thomas smiled. "As soon as you want. Tomorrow. If you're willing, Sheriff Morrison can perform the ceremony. He's licensed to marry folks." "Tomorrow," Alina agreed. "I do not want to wait another day to become your wife." They were married the next afternoon in the parlor of Thomas's ranch house, with Sheriff Morrison officiating and Doc Hartwell and Mrs. Henderson serving as witnesses. Alina wore her best dress, a simple blue gown that brought out the warmth. In her dark eyes, Ann Thomas wore his Sunday suit, looking more nervous than he had facing Diego's guns. The ceremony was brief but heartfelt. When Morrison pronounced them husband and wife, Thomas kissed Alina with the tender reverence of a man who had found his heart's home. Alina kissed him back with the passionate gratitude of a woman who had finally found her safe harbor. "Well," Doc Hartwell said with satisfaction as they signed the marriage certificate, "I don't think I've ever seen a more necessary wedding." Mrs. Henderson dabbed at her eyes with her handkerchief. "Beautiful," she declared. "Just beautiful." "Sheriff." Morrison clapped Thomas on the shoulder. "Treat her well, Thomas. I intend to." Thomas replied, his arm around Alina's waist.
"How?"
"For the rest of my life." That evening, after their guests had departed and they were finally alone, Thomas and Alina sat on their front porch watching the sun set over the Colorado mountains. Alina wore Thomas's jacket over her wedding dress, and her head rested on his shoulder as they rocked gently in the porch swing he had built for her during her recovery. "Mrs. Whitmore," Thomas said softly, testing the sound of her new name. "I like the sound of that," Alina murmured. "Though it will take some getting used to. We have time," Thomas said, pressing a kiss to the top of her head. "Right. All the time in the world." Alina tilted her face up to look at him. "You know what I was thinking about during the ceremony? The day I first came to your door? I was so frightened, so alone. I never imagined that this place would become my home, that you would become my family." "Fate," Thomas said simply. "It had to be. Nothing else could have brought us together through all of that pain and made something so beautiful." Alina smiled, the expression transforming her face with joy. "Then I am grateful for fate, even for the pain if it led me to you." "No more pain," Thomas promised. "From now on, only happiness. And love. And love. Always love." As the stars began to appear in the darkening sky, Thomas and Alina made quiet plans for their future. They would expand the ranch,